Philosophical theology is the use of the methods and approaches of philosophy to study religious faith, its conditions, its forms, its claims, and its significance. Today I want to talk about three things in relation to philosophical theology: its terminology, the use of the term philosophical theology in different contexts; its history, very briefly, because there is much to it; and then some key areas that we study in philosophical theology. So first, terminology. Philosophical theology is used in at least three different senses in the academy. The first is somewhat coterminous with the term philosophy of religion, which we also use. The second is a philosophically engaged theology, in other words, a use of philosophical methods and approaches to study questions that are characteristic specifically of theology. And the third, which is particularly relevant to the 19th century but is making a comeback, is philosophical theology as more or less coterminous with systematic theology. And that's in counter-distinction to other modes of theology such as historical or moral or biblical theology. In the first sense, philosophy of religion, philosophical theology is not theology proper, but is adjacent or even before the study of theology. It studies questions such as the existence of God or the arguments for and against adopting religious faith. And it can be studied like that in theological or Christian contexts, for example, as the study of fundamental theology in many German universities, or as a subject simply standing on its own without any propedeutic or Christian or apologetic intent, simply the philosophy of religion, which can be studied from any standpoint whatsoever. In its second sense, philosophical theology makes use of approaches and methods that were developed within philosophy to grapple with central questions of Christian theology, both with regard to God, with regard to the existence and nature of God, and with regard to how we understand human beings, how we understand language, how we understand even our central doctrines. And third, as I've said before, philosophical theology as coterminous with systematic theology in contradistinction to biblical, historical, or practical theology. This was quite relevant in patristic and scholastic eras, where we often saw philosophical theology simply used as another term for systematic theology, even in Thomas Aquinas, in distinction to Sacra Doctrina. And it then became very relevant in the 19th century, and I'll talk about that in a little while. Let's talk a little bit about the history of philosophical theology. Very potted, just very brief. But certainly engagement with philosophy, both in the early church, in the medieval church, and later, has been a major driver of theological thinking and really can't be thought out of the history of theology, more narrowly speaking. In the patristic era, as we all know, engagement particularly with the classical philosophies of Platonism, Neoplatonism, and Stoicism animated some of the great thinkers of the early church, certainly Augustine, Origen before him, and Boethius after. And in many ways, the reappropriation, the rethinking of key philosophical terms such as logos or hypostasis or ousia generated a way for Christian thinkers to engage with the biblical texts and make a metaphysics out of the narrative that they saw on the page. They didn't necessarily take those terms in exactly the same way that the Platonists or the Stoics used them, but they gave them, those words gave them conceptual tools to express something about the nature of God, about the triunity of God, and about the relationship of God to the world, which they couldn't get directly from the biblical texts, but which helped them to make sense of the unity of the biblical texts, which on the surface were relatively diverse. And so many of the debates of the early church were about the right way to philosophize about the biblical text, to do justice to the biblical text, but also to embed it in a whole way of understanding the world and understanding God. And secondly, about the question, the critical question, to what extent we ought to be relying on philosophical constructs to make sense of our faith. Because people were very aware that philosophical constructs change, that the Platonist worldview is a very different one from the Aristotelian one, is a different one from the Stoic one. And we are, in some sense, wagering our understanding of the world on constructs that are not directly derived from Christian revelation. So it was a very fraught topic, but also an extremely vibrant one, and generated really the most interesting debates of the early church. In the medieval period, engagement with Platonism certainly continued in Anselm, in Henry of Ghent, and others. But to that came also an excited and many-faceted reappropriation of Aristotle, whose works had been lost for a long time and now re-entered the Western medieval world through Arabic and Byzantine sources. And people like Aquinas, after a while, made this philosophy available again to theology. And especially in Aristotle's understanding of form and matter, of potentiality and act, gave Christians, again, a unified way of thinking about God in himself and about God in his relation to the world. And interestingly, in order to engage with these philosophical approaches and insights, new methods had to be developed of doing theology, which, particularly in the method of scholasticism, a way of commentating on texts, of organizing questions, of disputing in an orderly way about pros and cons of different answers. This method of scholasticism, which arose in response to philosophical sources, provided medieval theology with a way of systematizing and engaging with other faiths, which had almost been impossible hitherto. This kind of scholastic systematization and philosophical theology as a whole came under intense scrutiny during the Reformation of the Church, under Luther, Calvin, and others, partly because they returned to these debates that I mentioned earlier of the earliest Church, the question how far we can rely on any extra revelation, extra biblical sources for the contours of our faith. And so both philosophical tradition and the tradition of the Church were put aside in favor of an immediate reliance on God's action, on our faith in God, on God's grace, on the text of Scripture. And doctrines that had relied on philosophical counts, such as transubstantiation, for example, in relation to the Eucharist, were very intentionally replaced by much less philosophically informed doctrines, such as the real presence of Christ. So a return to a direct faith, a real skepticism about any philosophical framing of that faith, which then, interestingly, in the 17th century, began to be emphasized on the other side of the equation. In other words, people came to think that perhaps it was not the pure source of faith and of revelation that we should be relying on in understanding the world, but the pure source and foundation of reason, undetermined by revelation and by faith. In the 17th century, this radical separation between philosophy on the one hand and theology on the other came to motivate the question whether philosophy could not stand apart from theological claims, just as theology had seemed to be able to stand apart from philosophical claims. And many of the great philosophers of the 17th century, Descartes, Spinoza, and so forth, tried to reintegrate theology and philosophy not on the basis of revelation and tradition, but on the basis of reason, which meant a much more modest theology that derived its foundations purely from what we could reason our way to, from how we experienced the world in a pure way apart from tradition, and therefore what we could say of God without relying on revelation, which came to be seen as just as unreliable as reason or philosophy had come to be seen by the reformers. And so through the 17th century, we see these fascinating attempts, essentially by people who were still temperamentally steeped in the theological and Christian world in which they had grown up, yet nevertheless trying to reimagine what theology might be like without these things from beyond the human being. And many of these thinkers converged on what was later called deism, a very simple view of God as the creator of a universe that ran in an orderly and in a rational fashion. And many of the 18th century critiques then can be seen as questioning the viability of this deist formulation of theology. On the one hand, is it enough? On the other hand, is it even viable? Can we say that, can we reason our way to God at all? Hume's critique of causality drove a major wedge through deists in questioning whether we can reason our way from any phenomenon to a cause and then finally to the first cause, which suddenly seemed quite implausible. And Kant's critique of Hume, on the other hand, then tried to cut through this need to reason our way causally back to God by saying, no, reason actually cannot ever comprehend God. Because if we were to imagine a God at all, he would by definition be outside of our categories of thought. He would be outside any of the ways in which we habitually understand the world. If we understand the world generally as organized in space, well, God is not in space. If we understand the world generally as organized by time, causally, well, God is not in time. And so we are constitutionally unable to reason our way to God, not because there is no God, but because the categories of our thought are constitutively inadequate to anything that might be called God, that might be worthy of that appellation. And so for Kant, Hume's criticisms, the general rationalist criticisms, didn't really seem to grip the actual problem, which is how do we conceptualize God, if at all, and how does that interact with our usual way of engaging the world. And what Kant came to was a philosophical defense, if you will, of God, not as something we reason our way to, but as what he called a postulate of practical reason. In other words, God is the condition of the possibility of reasoning, and particularly of practical reasoning, of morality, of ethics at all. And Kant's argument for this was interesting because he said that, look, we all know intuitively that the good should also be the happy. And yet in this world we see that the good are not always the happy, that goodness doesn't lead to happiness, and that happiness doesn't require goodness. And yet we cannot act practically, we cannot act ethically without that deep intuition that happiness and goodness go together. And so we require a postulate of two things. One, the immortality of the soul, and two, the existence of God, to guarantee that in the eschaton, after death, in immortal life, the summum bonum will be reached, the highest good of goodness and happiness coinciding. So that was a really interesting new philosophical way of thinking about the existence of God as the condition of the possibility of certain ways of experiencing the world and experiencing ourselves. And philosophical theology in the 19th century really took that on, particularly with Friedrich Schleiermacher, if I can pronounce his name, Friedrich Schleiermacher, who postulated that religion is found neither in ethical postulates primarily, nor in rational constructs, but religion is found in our primordial, deep sense of absolute dependence on something that is not us, that is greater than us. If we see ourselves truly, we see ourselves as not self-caused, as always already in a world that exceeds us, and all other things as equally dependent. And that feeling of dependence points us back to God, and that is religion for him. There are other ways of following on from Kant, particularly Hegel's, of course, in the 19th century, who thought, again, that to participate in any way in the reality of God was not so much to engage in a particular mode of reasoning, but to participate historically in a movement of the self-realization of spirit, which we can't abstract, we can't abbreviate, we can only go through history seeing the unfolding of God as spirit in the world. These new moves of seeing religion and the existence of God not as objects of rational thought, but rather as conditions of our existence in the world, led people in the 19th century to argue about religion as natural to human beings. Religion, of course, at the time became a much wider term than merely Christianity. because other religions were being discovered in the course of colonization and were much studied. And the similarities between Christianity and other religions, both in their practices and in their myths, and sometimes in their claims, were very widely discussed. So in the 19th century, among philosophically informed people, it came to be generally agreed that religion is natural to human beings, that we are all religious in some way, and that Christianity is the consummate religion, of course. And therefore, that Christianity can, to some extent, be read out of or be, postulated by trajectory from any of the religious impulses of human beings, but that is also profoundly rational and can be therefore debated with other philosophers. And so Christianity was seen to stake three different kinds of claims: speculative, historical, and moral. And as I said before, when I talked about terminology, the speculative claims of Christianity were seen as both philosophical and theological, systematic, and were therefore really discussed as part and parcel of philosophical questions. And in the 19th century in the German universities, we see very little difference between philosophical discussions and theological discussions in that sense, because Christianity, as I say, was seen to be both natural and consummate and rational. The great catastrophe of the First World War and of all the crisis of European culture that surrounded it put, I would almost say, a decisive end to this. Theology and Christianity were very much part and parcel of the 19th century project of education and of general upward mobility of not only individuals but societies as a whole. In the 19th century, there was an immense amount of optimism among philosophers and theologians about the perfectibility of human individuals and human culture and society, in which philosophical theology played its part. And in the early 20th century, it was realized that this perfectibility seemed to be a sham, that the First World War was certainly not the war to end all wars, that the great German project of education had collapsed into militarism, and that philosophy and theology had been implicated in a grand delusion that was now ruining Europe as a continent. And so in the 20s, already in the 19-teens, both philosophy and theology needed to radically repristinate. They needed to think again how much they had been implicated in a sort of self-delusion of grandeur, which was not warranted by either the strong foundations of philosophy or the strong, reliable foundations of theology. And theologians came to reorient themselves by passages of scripture that reminded them of the weakness of the Christian faith, of the consistent opposition to perfectibility in the world, which would only be overcome by the second coming of Christ. At the same time, and we see that in figures like Karl Barth, of course, who radically rejected any grand project of Christianity or Christendom in favor of a deep and paradoxical relationship of the individual to God, which always broke into time and history perpendicular to its purposes. Philosophy, at the same time, repristinated by two different strategies. On the one hand, primarily English-speaking philosophers tried to refound philosophy or, regather ground on a very rigorous modeling on the sciences, on clear propositions, on logical positivism, on only things that could be proved. Philosophers on the continent, meanwhile, German-speaking, French-speaking, wanted to refound their discipline on a strict observance of experience. So, quasi-scientific operation on the one hand, a strict attention to how experience is constituted, how the world presents itself to us, how we are always situated within particular presuppositions and particular contexts that we can never escape, from which we can never assume a sort of emancipated God's eye view of the world, on the other hand. And that first strategy of strict logical positivism developed into what we now call the analytic school of philosophy. And the strict attention to our situatedness in the world, to our always being less than objective, flowered into what we now call continental philosophy. And both of those strands of philosophy were very averse for a while to anything that we might call metaphysics. Neither of them wanted to step beyond the boundaries that they had set themselves methodologically, and both were very wary of the kinds of metaphysical claims that 19th century philosophy had made, and by which it had, framed the world in a way that had turned out to be illusory. So we have, in a sense, similar strategies in theology, which again, and we'll remember this from the Reformation, tried to become more modest philosophically, to focus on the biblical word, to focus on the individual's relationship to God, and was therefore averse to metaphysics, and these anti-metaphysical strategies of the continental and the analytic schools. So to some extent, the continuation or the development of philosophy was accelerated by this split, because each of these schools could work within their own methods and approaches in a consolidated way that pushed them forward. But on the other hand, of course, it was also crippled by that split, because on the one hand, analytic philosophy had very powerful methods of investigating propositions, of investigating certain questions. And on the other hand, it did not touch some of the key questions that continental philosophy was asking about what it is to be human, about how it is to live in the world, because they just seemed too messy. So we had two schools that hardly talked to each other, and we had a theology that was wrestling with very similar questions and with its own methodological splits. And it was only in the late 20th century that both the philosophers and the theologians realized that even the approaches that they had been developing were not immune from metaphysics, that you couldn't ask even the kinds of questions that they were asking without taking into account that behind what you're saying there is a view, an understanding of the structure of the world as a whole, which if we don't formulate explicitly, we nevertheless hold implicitly. And so in the later 20th century, we see a wonderful redevelopment of metaphysics, of large-scale questions about the order of the world, re-emerging from within the methods both of analytic and of continental philosophy, and a reintegration, to some extent, with theological questions. In the analytic vein, analytic theology was founded by Oliver Crisp and Mike Ray, which tried to use the precision and the rigor and the clarity of analytic philosophy to investigate, without any shame or embarrassment, questions that arose from within theology, doctrinal questions and so forth. On the other hand, we have people like Jean-Luc Mariot and others who saw phenomenology and hermeneutics, the key methods of continental philosophy, as naturally leading to the question, what is the metaphysical constitution of the world? Or if not metaphysical, then what are the horizons within which we are human? And those can't be merely immanent. And so a reintegration there with theological questions as well. And we now find ourselves in a position where the analytic and continental schools of philosophy, quite apart from theology, are once again becoming interested in each other, but also within philosophical theology, where analytic and continental folk are trying to reintegrate their approaches for a more unified approach of the world, which I think is made possible by the return of metaphysics to the horizons of both of those continental and analytic, both of those philosophical approaches.